stories. Let's start with CNN's Sunlen Serfati and the scathing new report on Hillary Clinton's emails. Sunlen, update our viewers. What are you learning?
Well, Wolf, Hillary Clinton has said time and time again that she believes she was in compliance with State Department rules in setting up and using her private email server. But this new IG report says exactly the opposite.
Tonight, Hillary Clinton is back on the defensive. In a scathing 83-page report, the State Department's own Inspector General determined that Clinton violated federal rules. It scolds the former Secretary of State for setting up and using her private email server to conduct State Department business. The report reads in part, quote, at a minimum, Secretary Clinton should have surrendered all emails dealing with department business before leaving government service. Clinton has pushed back on questions over her emails many times in the past, telling CNN's Brianna Keeler last July.
The truth is, everything I did was permitted, and I went above and beyond what anybody could have expected in making sure that if the State Department didn't capture something, I made a real effort to get it to them.
But the report says that, quote, sending emails from a personal account to other employees at their department accounts is not an appropriate method of preserving any such emails. Clinton has also maintained that she had permission to use personal email.
I opted for convenience to use my personal email account, which was allowed by the State Department, because I thought it would be easier to carry just one device for my work and for my personal emails instead of two.
But not so, says the report. The Inspector General's office found no evidence that Clinton or her staff consulted anyone at State before she decided to use her private server. The Clinton campaign today trying to downplay the significance. Clinton spokesman Brian Fallon saying in a statement, quote, the Inspector General documents just how consistent her email practices were with those of other secretaries and senior officials at the State Department who also used personal email. The report does call out past secretaries of state for their use of email, but specifically notes the rules were updated the year Clinton took office.
Look, the emails, that's bad judgment.
The email controversy has been a constant target for Donald Trump.
She had a little bad news today, as you know, from some reports came down weren't so good, but not so good. The Inspector General's report, not good.
And the new findings are likely to hand him even more ammunition to bring to the general election fight ahead.
For her to be able to continue to run is an absolute disgrace, in my opinion, to this country.
And the IG report does call out the State Department writ large for being overall, they say, really disorganized with their email practices in general. And there has been considerable pushback to this report today, not only from the State Department, who says they've already made many of the changes that this report suggests, but also from Democrats on Capitol Hill who slam the IG report as being too partisan, Wolf, a point that the Clinton campaign alluded to today as well. Wolf.
All right, Sunlen Serfati, thanks very much. Our Justice correspondent, Evan Perez, he's also been going through the Inspector General's very lengthy report. Evan, you've spent a lot of time on this. What surprises you the most?
Well, I got to tell you, Wolf, that the fact that the former Secretary of State decided that she was not going to cooperate with an investigation by the Inspector General for the department that she led, neither did her aides, is really surprising, because this is obviously not just a former Secretary of State, but she's running for president. And we know, according to this report, that former Secretaries of State did cooperate, as did the current Secretary of State, John Kerry.
Did anyone at the State Department raise any red flags or object to what was going on with that private email server at the time, or was it only after this whole story blew up, shall we say, when she was running for president, that this became an issue?
Well, according to this report, at least a couple of people, lower-level people, did raise some concerns about the use of this private server, Wolf, and they raised it to their supervisor, a civil service person inside the State Department. What they were told was that it's been approved from high up and that they should not raise it again. Now, we know from the report that they never, as Sunlen just mentioned, they never got any approval from the legal department or from the security folks at the State Department for the use of this server.
Evan Perez reporting for us. Thank you, Evan. Now for the Clinton campaign's response to the Inspector General's report, I'm joined by the campaign press secretary, Brian Fallon. Brian, thanks very much for joining us.
Hi, Wolf. Thanks for having me.
All right, let's get through this. Up until today, the secretary always said that what she did was allowed under the rules. But this report says the State Department did not and would not have approved of her exclusive reliance on a personal email account. If she didn't get approval from anyone at the State Department, doesn't that mean she broke the rules?
No, Wolf. I think what the secretary has said is that the use of personal email by officials at the State Department was allowed. And that was confirmed today by the report. The rules that were just cited that disallowed personal use for work purposes were enacted after she left. At the time that she took office and for the duration of her tenure there, the use of personal email for work purposes was not disallowed. And in fact, as documented in great detail by the report, personal email was utilized by 90+ different top officials at the State Department over the years that they looked at, including 2 other secretaries of state besides Hillary Clinton. So the practice was widespread. In fact, if you just look at those top officials, 90+ different officials, it seemed to be the rule rather than the exception. That's what she's been referring to, and that was upheld by the report today.
These other officials did use personal email, but only 3 officials used it exclusively. Former Secretary of State Colin Powell, a former U.S. ambassador to Kenya, and Secretary Clinton. The others also had government email accounts. These were the only 3 that used it exclusively, and the report concludes that there was no evidence that the secretary requested or obtained guidance or approval to conduct official business via personal email account on her private server.
Well, Wolf, let's really get to the heart of the question, and that is, were records preserved, were they retained in keeping with the rules and regulations that required them to be preserved and retained? And even though she used personal email exclusively for work business, she did make it a practice of seeking to ensure that there'd be a permanent record preserved of all of those work-related emails. Her way of doing that was to always ensure that there was someone on a state.gov account that was copied or on the correspondence. When it turned out, when the State Department looked back and said, well, because of our shoddy record keeping, there's actually 2 years where we should have the records, but don't, she came forward, and because she had not gotten rid of those work-related emails, because she had preserved them, she was able to turn over 55,000 pages of work-related emails.
Who gave her, Brian, who gave her the legal opinion that she could exclusively use a private email server, a private email account for all of her work-related business?
Well, Wolf, I'm not sure that it was ever contemplated that a specific opinion, a legal opinion, was needed, considering that this was the practice of her predecessor as Secretary of State in the person of Colin Powell, as well as top aides to Condoleezza Rice and other administrations. So the idea that the State Department Inspector General is putting forward today, that in retrospect, if they had been approached, they would have suggested, well, maybe don't use the personal server. From the standpoint of whether records were preserved or not, that question is beside the point. She kept all the records. The records were turned over. 55,000 pages of them were. And in that respect, she far exceeded any of her predecessors who made just as ample use of personal email as she did.
But the Inspector General's report says specifically, and I'll read it to you, by Secretary Clinton's tenure, not Colin Powell or previous secretaries, the department's guidance was considerably more detailed and more sophisticated. There were different rules in place for her that she apparently did obey.
Well, they were very careful with their wording in that passage, Wolf, and that's for a reason. Because while it's true that the rules and regulations were updated, they were not updated to such a degree where they ever disallowed personal use of email for work purposes. And so that's why, even though the rules were slightly different than they were for Colin Powell, personal use of email for work purposes was still allowed under the rules in place at the time.
The report quotes a staff member working for Hillary Clinton as saying this, raising concerns. I'll put it up on the screen. One staff member raised concerns that information sent and received on Secretary Clinton's account could contain federal records that needed to be preserved in order to satisfy federal record-keeping requirements. According to the staff member, the director stated that the secretary's personal system had been reviewed and approved by the department legal staff, and that the matter was not to be discussed any further. So 2 questions. Who approved it, and why couldn't it be discussed any further.
So I've seen that passage of the report, and I think that Evan Perez's reporting on that is accurate. This is a career employee. It was unknown to us that any such instructions were ever given to any lower level person. So whoever that career civil servant was that gave those instructions was not reflecting anything that had ever been said by the secretary or somebody like Cheryl Mills, her chief of staff. We're unaware of what the basis for that is. Not challenging that it was said, but it wasn't reflecting any instructions that were given from the secretary's office.
The report states that Hillary Clinton's use of a personal email system to contact State Department employees was, quote, not an appropriate method of preserving emails that would constitute a federal record, and then quotes the secretary from back in 2010. The deputy chief of staff emailed the secretary that we should talk about putting you on state email or releasing your email address to the department so you are not going to spam. In response, the secretary wrote, quote, let's get separate address or device, but I don't want any risk of the personal being accessible. Here's the question. Was the purpose of the private email server to prevent any of her personal emails going public?
No, that was not the purpose. And let me just break down real quickly that exchange with Huma Abedin, who sent that email. The instance there related to a fact that some of her emails that she was sending to her colleagues in the State Department were being sent to a spam folder. And so it was sort of interrupting their ability to conduct work over email. And so Huma suggested that as a remedy to this situation, perhaps we should look at setting you up on a state.gov email account for work purposes. And the secretary expressed openness to that, which in my mind contradicts this theory that she was seeking to avoid government email at all costs. She, in fact, expressed openness to it. The only reservation she had there was that in setting up a government account for using it for work purposes, she certainly didn't want to intermix any of her personal correspondence on the government account, which of course is perfectly appropriate. But as it happened, they were able to work through that issue where the spam folder was blocking some of her emails, which is an issue that most people can relate to. And she ended up continuing to use the existing email account for both work and personal use.
But the report clearly says she did something. She says she did nothing wrong, but the report clearly contradicts that. That's the bottom line, right?
Well, look, I think a big reason why the report finds that it was unacceptable and fell short for her to be using this habit of copying her aides on her correspondence was because it turned out that the record keeping in place at the State Department was so poor that that didn't ensure that those records were being preserved. And certainly with the benefit of hindsight, if we were aware that the record keeping systems in the State Department were not tracking that correspondence, I think she would have sought to figure out another way to ensure that records were preserved.
But let me interrupt for a moment, because the report also says there were a lot of emails that were missing. The department and the Office of the Inspector General both determined that the production included no email covering the first few months of Secretary Clinton's tenure. Why were these emails missing? Why were they deleted?
So that much is not new, Wolf. So that's actually a fact that has been long known to people that have followed this issue closely, because there was a period where she was still using an old BlackBerry and had not yet transitioned to the server. There was a couple-month period there at the beginning of her tenure as Secretary of State. And so when she went last year to turn over 55,000 pages of emails to the State Department, she was only able to retrieve and produce all the emails that were still residing on the server. And since some of those emails in that 2-month period predated the setting up of the email account on the server, they weren't available for her to turn over.
Brian, I want you to stand by. There are more questions. This Inspector General report raised all sorts of questions. We have some of them. We're going to continue this conversation right after a quick break.